The European Union is divided on Gaza. Germany fully supports Israel, while others like Spain, Belgium and Ireland are calling for an end to this war. So what's behind these divisions, and can a split EU play any meaningful role? This is Inside Story. Hello there and welcome to the programme. I'm Nastasya Tay. The war on Gaza has exposed deep divisions within the European Union on policy towards Israel and Palestine. The only unity found has been in condemning Hamas and its attacks on October 7th, which killed around 1,200 Israelis. But there's been no such unity against Israel's killing of thousands of Palestinians, most of whom were women and children. At one end, Germany fully supports Israel. At the other, Belgium wants sanctions. The EU has strong trading ties with Israel, including arms supplies, but also provides humanitarian aid for Palestinians. On cultural and sporting levels, Israel takes part in European football, for example, unlike the ban on Russia since the Ukraine war. So can EU policy on Gaza even be defined when it's all so divided? Is it effectively pro-Israel? Is this war changing positions? We'll bring in our guests in just a moment, but first, this report from Fintan Monaghan.
The European Union is divided on Gaza. Speaking in the European Parliament, the bloc's foreign policy chief addressed the growing rift between those who support Israel's war and those who sympathise with the plight of the Palestinians.
We ought to be able to defend the Palestinians' rights to have a state without being categorised as anti-Semitic, and it ought to be possible to criticise the policies of Israel.
The European Union was quick to condemn the Hamas attack on Israel on October 7th that killed around 1,200 people. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen went to Tel Aviv in a show of solidarity.
In the face of this unspeakable tragedy, there's only one possible response. Europe stands with Israel.
But since then, the EU has failed to form a united position on Israel's subsequent bombing and ground campaign in Gaza that's killed around 15,000 Palestinians. Individual countries are going their own way and engaging in their own diplomacy. Some, like German Chancellor Olaf Scholz, have rejected calls for a permanent ceasefire.
For us, it remains clear that Israel has the right and responsibility to defend itself as part of the humanitarian rule of international law.
The leaders of Spain and Belgium recently visited the Middle East and are among the vocal advocates of a lasting truce.
The time has come to break for good this endless cycle of violence that has condemned the region for decades. We cannot afford, and above all, Israelis and Palestinians cannot afford to continue to live under the constant threat of conflict and war.
In recent weeks, there's been some consensus on humanitarian aid, but on the war itself, many member states remain far apart. The European Union has forged a common front on major international issues, including the conflict in Ukraine. But the war on Gaza has exposed lingering divisions that will not be easy to overcome. Fintan Monaghan for Inside Story.
Well, as I mentioned, EU support for Israel over the years has also included arms contracts. Earlier this month, as the war in Gaza raged, Finland agreed a deal for Israel to supply it with an air defence system worth $340 million. Over the years, according to the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, Germany and Italy have been two of the main EU arms suppliers to Israel. Now, over the past 10 years, Berlin has provided more than 1,000 tank engines to Israel, while it's also sent warships and submarines. The weapon systems were then later added by Israel. Since the October 7th attacks, Germany has authorized a tenfold increase in its defense exports to Israel, valued at more than $300 million. And on a smaller scale, Italian companies also provide a steady supply of arms to Israel. That trade is worth an estimated $12 million a year. Well, let's now bring in our guests. They're all joining us from Brussels, the headquarters of the EU. Grace O'Sullivan is a member of the European Parliament representing the Green Party in Ireland. She's also a member of the European Parliament's Delegation for Relations with Palestine. Martin Konecny is the founder and director of the European Middle East Project an independent organisation specialising in European and international policies on the Israel-Palestine conflict. And we also have Suzanne Lynch. She's the chief Brussels correspondent for Politico and also hosts its podcast, EU Confidential. Thank you so much for joining us today on Inside Story. A warm welcome to each of you. Suzanne, I'll start with you because I know you were on the ground there in the building at the last EU summit. Can you give us a read at the moment of the tone of the conversation? We obviously know that the divisions are deep. How entrenched are they?
I think they're extremely entrenched. I think the problem for the EU is that the European Commission in particular doesn't really have a strong role when it comes to foreign policy. At the end of the day, this is the prerogative of each member state. The EU comprises 27 different countries. A lot of the time, as you mentioned in the report, they coalesce in what they believe. For example, with Russia's invasion of Ukraine, there was pretty much broad consensus about how to respond to that. On the Israeli-Palestinian issue, however, it has always been a very divisive issue. So you have a very different perspective on that conflict if you were, for example, in Germany and Austria, or if you're in Spain and Ireland. And I think one of the failings of the EU is that in the early days, in the days following October 7th, after that Hamas attack on Israel, the European Commission President, Ursula von der Leyen, and the head of the European Parliament, Roberta Metsola, decided to go to Tel Aviv to show their support to Israel, but didn't consult with others, did not consult with the other parts of the EU and indeed by member states. So although they had the support of some countries for this, some countries weren't happy that they went and spoke for Europe on that. So since that, I think the EU has been struggling to project a united front, to put out its own version, its own stance on this issue. And they've been on the back foot, really, since October the 7th about getting ahead of this story and trying to establish some kind of a unified stance on this.
Grace, you've been very, very critical, openly critical of the European Parliament and how, well, the lack of stance on this issue. Has the tone there shifted as this war has continued and we've seen the death toll rise in Gaza?
I think there is a very slight shift. I suppose going back several months, I was in the West Bank and East Jerusalem, and we were asking when we came home from that EU mission that there would be clear communication in relation to the Palestinian and Israeli situation, and there was no appetite whatsoever. Really, there was no appetite for any one to engage on that level. And now the slight shift I think we're seeing is that we have the EU Foreign Chief Borrell today saying that that recognising Palestine will provide security for Israelis and peace for Palestine. So there is a slight shift. Nevertheless, I completely agree with what Suzanne was saying. I mean, there has been absolute chaos since the 7th of October, mixed messaging, no clear line of communication from the EU in relation to the situation. And there are things we can do. I mean, there's very clear actions we can take. What we're calling for is that we look at the trade relationship with Israel and where there are obvious international breaches of law, then we have to take some action. So we're seeing kind of a double speak, really, because on one hand, in terms of Ukraine and Russia, the EU is quite clear and consistent. In terms of Palestine, Gaza, and Israel, we are not seeing clear direction whatsoever, and this is a huge problem.
Well, that contrast has been very stark throughout this conflict. Grace, you talk there about this chaos that's emerged in the EU. Martin, let me ask you a little more about that, because divisions at the member state level aren't all that uncommon. But there has been a lot of division, too, seemingly at very high levels of leadership. Charles Michel, the president of the European Council, Ursula von der Leyen, the president of the European Commission, they haven't exactly been seeing eye to eye on this. Can you unpack some of those dynamics for us?
Yes, exactly. I mean, the divisions between member states are kind of usual on this issue. But as Suzanne already mentioned, what has been maybe unique or unusual about the response to this particular crisis is the stance taken by the President of the European Commission and the President of the European Parliament, Roberta Metsola. The President of the Commission is Ursula von der Leyen. And they have taken positions which firmly sided with Israel and with the Israeli narrative. And that created a division at the level of the EU leadership. As opposed to them, Mr. Borrell, whom you have mentioned already, the EU foreign policy chief, took a, let's say, much more moderate, nuanced position. And Charles Michel, the president of the European Council, has been somewhere in between them, I would say closer to Borrell. So yes, we have had divisions at the levels of member states and also at the level of the top EU leadership. And I would say there have been also divisions within each member state, because ultimately this is because we Europeans are divided about this issue everywhere.
I want to get to some of those national level dynamics in just a minute. But Suzanne, you mentioned, we've been talking a lot here about leadership, and you mentioned that trip that von der Leyen made to Israel very, very quickly after October 7th in the aftermath of those attacks. And there's been speculation about whether that was in her capacity as a German politician or as an EU leader. And obviously, Germany's taken a very, very strong stance on this, and they've been very pro-Israel. There's obviously a huge amount of history there as well. Can you explain that a little for us?
Yeah, I mean, it is important to say that Ursula von der Leyen is a German politician. She's the German representative of the European Commission. And I think instinctively, she decided to go to Israel. And I think her political mistake was that she didn't envisage that this would be controversial. I think she genuinely didn't see the problem with this, that she would maybe need to consult with other people, that this was going to be a divisive issue. She went there without kind of thinking. We know did not inform Josep Borrell, the foreign policy chief, or Charles Michel, who represents member states. So we know that happened. And I do think that does reflect her nationality. I mean, her background, she comes from, she's got a lot of German advisors as well. And I mean, the reality is Germany, because of their history, because of the history of the Holocaust, has a very pro-Israel stance in its foreign policy. I was in Berlin myself a few weeks ago, and this came through, the coalition government in Germany. 3 different parties are in government, and it is cross-party, the sense that they see the pro-Israel and Israel's right, as they see it, to defend itself as core to their own foreign policy. Now, they're not alone. Germany also has this. Other countries that have this stance include Austria, I'm thinking Czech Republic, Hungary, etc. So, I mean, that is because Germany is the biggest country in the EU, what it says matters. So I think the other issue for von der Leyen and Metsola is that they left it a little bit too long after the October the 7th attacks, whereas the Biden administration, Secretary Blinken, went fairly quickly in a few days and then reached out to some other Gulf countries. They left it until maybe 6 days afterwards, went to Tel Aviv, and there was no outreach to any Arab countries. So I think, again, there was a kind of naivety about how this would play across the EU, whereas even the Biden administration, was more nuanced in its approach, even at that stage. But she, it has to be said, we're coming to the end of the EU's 5-year mandate at the moment. We have elections next year. Ursula von der Leyen has been seen as a very strong Commission president, very popular. This is her first kind of big mishap, I think. So she's definitely on the back foot since that reaction played out in the week or so following the October the 7th attack.
Suzanne, you were saying there that the support in Germany for Israel seems to cross the political spectrum there. I was interested to see that even the Greens have obviously come out very strongly pro-Israel, very much in contrast to your Green Party in Ireland, Grace. Is that something that took you by surprise?
No, not necessarily, because as Suzanne said, I mean, in Germany you have it's that history, and the German Greens are, large here in the European Parliament. The Germans in the group are the largest group in our case. So I'm not altogether surprised. However, I think it shows a weakness here in the European Union, where members from smaller parties or governments, are almost at a disadvantage. So that Germany, because it's the largest group in the largest country with members in the European Union, that they almost have a disproportionate amount of leverage. And I think Ursula von der Leyen made a huge mistake by not consulting and just taking off to Tel Aviv in support. But I do think that governments like Ireland, we've been extremely consistent. Even today now, the Irish ambassador to Israel has been brought into the for a discussion because of over the weekend, the Prime Minister of Ireland, the Taoiseach Leo Varadkar, his comments on the release of the hostages and the language he used. So, but just to come back to Europe, I still think we are not working together as a union, which is our primary function, and there's not clear messaging. And instead of working it out and coming up with a unified position, we're still fudging, we're still unsure, and it just isn't good enough. And for example, the fact that we haven't called for a ceasefire, that we call for a humanitarian pause, is from my perspective, just not good enough.
I want to get to some of that language in just a minute, but Martin, just staying with this idea of divides on the lines of the political spectrum, which we've just been talking about, do you think that that's broadly the case across Europe? You were talking earlier about divisions within countries themselves and how to approach this.
Yes, I would say there are divisions in each country, but Ireland is different from Germany. And Germany is different from, let's say, France, and Czech Republic and Hungary are somewhere else as well. So within each country, you have divisions, right? But let's say in Ireland, all the major parties, including on the center right, agree with strong calls for, respect for international law, for example. Whereas in Germany, even the Greens, and even the socialists on the center left would be very cautious about expressing any criticism or any qualification for the Israeli operation. So the context differs from country to country, but within each country you have fierce internal debate and even political conflict. In France, for example, the left-wing coalition preparing for the elections, the European elections next year, has actually broken down around this issue. So it has real serious political consequences in different countries in Europe.
Martin, we've also seen the rise of the far right in many countries in Europe, and I'm curious about how that plays into this dynamic.
Yes, it plays into it very much, because for the far right and even hard right, which is really ascendant, is growing in Europe. You saw the results of the Dutch elections last week, in which the far right party won. All these far-right parties are very strongly supportive, unconditionally, of Israel, and even some of them explicitly of the occupation and building of settlements. That's the case of this Dutch leader. And that's because for them, Israel is a sort of a model of a country which applies very tough line against the other, the Arabs and Muslims, which links to the debate about immigration and integration in European societies. So these two things connect together and they kind of overlap. And Israel-Palestine becomes a part of a kind of a culture war, which is going on in Europe around these issues.
Suzanne, do you agree with that? The idea of this being part of that broader culture war? And I'm curious, does this also, the way that Europe has approached this, and this lack of unity around this issue, has that affected the way that the EU is seen outside of the EU by Arab states, potentially?
Well, I think that is one of the dangers for the EU. And you've heard figures like Josep Borrell, the foreign policy chief, who's taken pretty much a more pro-Palestinian stance on this. He has raised concerns about this. He's worried about the impact this is going to have on the EU's reputation in the wider area. And actually today there's a kind of a sub-meeting in Spain with representatives from Arab countries, but also from across Europe, different foreign ministers, to try and talk more about, what the situation post-war, and maybe ceasefire ideas and that kind of thing. So I think there was a worry among some people that the EU would lose some clout, would lose some respect from certain countries in the Gulf, for example, in the wider Middle East, because of the way it handled the attack in the first place. And in saying that, I do think this is a problem for the EU, because ultimately the EU is a very important institution. It's one of the biggest trading blocs of the world. It's almost 500 million people, but the EU's role is not really as a major foreign policy player. It's not a military power. That's the job of NATO probably more than the EU, for example. It is a big trading bloc, and what it does matters. But even with the war in Ukraine, where it's had the most effect is on sanctions and those kind of things, rather than that hard military power. So in a sense, I think it's underlined to many how unimportant in one way the EU is when it comes to foreign policy, because we had a situation, you mentioned the summit there a few weeks ago when all the EU leaders met here in Brussels, and while they were haggling about language for about 5 or 6 hours, whether they would use the word pause or pauses, it wasn't even being covered in Israeli media. People didn't even know this meeting was happening in Brussels. And I think that kind of showed that disconnect, that even though there was this agonizing debate here in Brussels about the EU stance, it's limited in terms of what impact that is actually having on the ground, and whether it is having much effect on how this war is playing out.
Suzanne, I just want to pick up on something you mentioned there, that the focus for a lot of EU diplomats, Josep Borrell in particular, has been on the so-called day after, on this kind of trying to define a post-war future for the Palestinian territories. Suzanne, do you think that that's partly because there's been so much division around this language, humanitarian pause, ceasefire, humanitarian pauses, that they're rather focusing on something that there is perhaps it's easier to find consensus on?
Yes, perhaps. And it's interesting the way to see where they coalesce. So, for example, you're hearing a lot of language from Borrell in particular about the UN. But the United Nations generally has taken, it has taken a more, shall we say, balanced approach reflecting the makeup of the UN. So you're often going to hear from Borrell, for example, a mention of UN calls to adhere to international law, etc. But I do think, though, as well with the EU, what's happening, behind the scenes is that a lot of the bigger countries, France, Germany, who are members of the G7 or the G20, like there are also discussions happening on that level. They're also attacking close to the US position, the UK position. So I think as well as the EU stance, you've also got this other layer where some of the bigger EU countries are part of that and are privy to those conversations. So I don't think anything is happening in a vacuum here. For all the talk about the EU getting a stance, there are also these others, the UN, the G20, the G7, and they're also part of the conversation, with some of the EU countries being part of those. And I think that's impacting how they're speaking about this.
Grace, I see you nodding there. I want to bring you in here and also just ask you to reflect upon the role that the EU plays, what kind of an impact it can make. As Suzanne was saying, in some places it might be considered a little bit peripheral, but is the EU potentially very powerful in its ability to influence other powerful players?
We really have opportunity to be more involved, but I definitely think within the EU itself, we've got to get our own house in order very, very quickly, and we have to try to come to some kind of a unified position that we need this war to end. We need this conflict to end, because the loss of civilian lives, the loss of humanitarian workers' lives, the UN are losing people. I mean, there's such a catastrophic loss of life that the EU must engage more positively and try to restore the damage we've done to the whole union over the last course of weeks, because we haven't shown the capacity to give leadership. And even on that, I mean, the fact that I said I've been there in February, and already, there was no appetite within the European Union to discuss the situation prior to the 7th of October attack, that we have to move towards a two-state solution. That, to my mind, and I know that would be a strong Irish position.
We've been hearing that as well from a lot of... we've been hearing that a lot from EU leaders in terms of a two-state solution. And Josep Borrell has been reiterating again today that they envision only that the Palestinian Authority would be the body that would have to take control of a post-war Gaza. Martin, I want to bring you in here on something that Grace mentioned, and that's aid, EU aid to Palestine. Now, obviously, a huge amount of that aid goes through the Palestinian Authority, the PA. How much do you think that aid buys the EU sway in trying to help determine a post-war Palestinian future?
Well, the aid is given to the Palestinian side only, so it doesn't buy much influence with the Israeli side, although Israel is actually has a strong interest in the continuation of this aid, because it sort of helps keep stability and to continue the Israeli occupation. So I think the issue here is with being able to apply the EU's leverage to both sides, and in particular Israel as the occupying party. People can agree on the two-state solution as a slogan, and it is, interesting to see that that's where you have more unity. Everybody is now talking about it. But how do you move beyond the slogan? If you want to actually advance the two-state solution, one of the things it means is, for example, countering the growth of the Israeli settlements in the West Bank, which make the two-state solution impossible. And this is where you immediately get into a problem. Take Ursula von der Leyen, about whom we have spoken. Her stances on the last month are not new, actually. And, when there was a discussion about how to address the possibility of annexation of the West Bank, she stood on the brakes and she prevented a discussion about possible EU measures to oppose the annexation. So this is where there is a problem. People agree on a slogan, but as soon as we move into discussing policy measures that could help advance the two-state solution, you get a division and you get a blockage from people and governments who side unconditionally with Israel.
Let me bring you in here, sorry, just very briefly, Suzanne, because there's been a lot of discussion about what countries can do. And here we're talking about various different policies on various different issues that are very contentious in Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories. Some countries are now obviously going it alone. We've seen Belgium come out with some very, very strong language. There's, I believe, even some legislation in the works to ban trade with settlements in the occupied territories. Suzanne, do you think that as you sit there in the EU, that we might see other countries try to do the same?
Yes, I think you can. I mean, at the end of the day, countries are quite protective when it comes to it about their own foreign policy. Yes, as I said earlier, I mean, the EU does want to have a united stance, but at the end of the day, each country has its own foreign policy. So I do think that you're going to see, and you have been seeing, each country take its own stance on this to an extent, and reflecting their public's view, but also their political view, if they have a coalition government, etc. And I think you're going to see more of that. There's growing frustration among some countries that the EU is, taking too long to put out statements on this over the last few days. It is very hard for them to even put out a statement because you've got these 27 different views. And you have some countries blocking a statement. So, yeah, I think we are going to be seeing some more kind of unilateral moves or countries taking a stronger stance either way on this issue.
Well, thank you all for reflecting on this with me. Obviously, this is a huge issue going forward as the conflict seems set to continue. Grace O'Sullivan, Martin Konecny and Suzanne Lynch, thank you so much for joining us here on Inside Story, and thank you too for watching. You can see this programme again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, do go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. Remember, you can also join the conversation on X. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Nastasya Tay, and the whole team here in Doha. Bye for now.